You think you know Snow White, right? Evil stepmother, magic mirror, 7 quirky little guys, poisoned apple, true love's kiss, the whole cozy Disney package. But what if I told you the story you grew up with is basically a crime scene with glitter thrown over it? Because the original Snow White wasn't a cute bedtime story. It was a warning, a coded message about real crimes, real abuse, and dangers that medieval people absolutely understood but couldn't talk about openly. Before we get any deeper into the cannibal moms and Judas apples, real quick, if you're into dark origins of fairy tales, hidden symbolism, and the creepy stuff hiding in children's stories, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which fairy tale you want decoded next. It seriously helps the channel and lets me keep digging into this kind of disturbing history. Alright, let's ruin Snow White together. First, we need to erase one word from the modern version: stepmother. In the very first version, the Brothers Grimm wrote down in 1812, there was no stepmother. The villain was Snow White's actual biological mother. No second wife. No jealous queen who married Snow's dad later. Just mother. In the manuscript, in Jacob Grimm's careful handwriting, the word is simply die mutter, the mother. Not stepmother, not replacement. The woman ordering her 7-year-old daughter's death? Her real mom. And this mom doesn't just send the hunter out to kill her and walk away. She wants proof. She demands Snow White's lungs and liver. When she receives what she believes are her daughter's organs, she doesn't bury them, she doesn't burn them, she doesn't even hide them. She has the cook boil them in salt, and then she eats them, greedily, believing she is literally consuming her child's essence. Let that sink in for a second. This is the kids' story foundation. Now, the Grimms later edited this. They knew their audience was starting to shift toward families and children, so in later editions, they quietly swapped mother for stepmother. But that early version, that's the raw one, closer to what old peasant storytellers were actually saying. And when you zoom out, you realize this wasn't just some random sick twist. Across Europe, there are similar stories where mothers harm or even devour daughters who threaten their status or beauty. It's not about gore for shock value. It's about fear. Specifically, the fear that the person who's supposed to protect you might be the one trying to erase you. So what was this story really warning about? Think less evil sorcery, more domestic violence and infanticide. In medieval German households, especially noble ones, daughters weren't cuddly little princesses. They were assets. Their value was in how they could be married off, what alliances they could create, what wealth and status they could bring in. And sometimes, a young girl's beauty didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like a threat. Imagine you're a noblewoman in that world. Your power depends on your looks, your charm, your ability to move in court and negotiate marriages. Then suddenly, your daughter grows up. She's prettier, younger, and more desirable to the same men whose attention you rely on. That mirror on the wall, that's not about who's the hottest. It's about who's more valuable now. When the mirror says Snow White is the fairest of them all, medieval listeners wouldn't have heard that as a cute compliment. They would have understood it as a verdict, a shift in power. The daughter has become more valuable than the mother. And in a system where women's worth is tied to how they can be used, that shift could literally be deadly. If you're still with me, tell me in the comments. Which part already feels way darker than what you grew up with? The cannibal mother, the child bride angle, or the mirror as a political tool? I'm genuinely curious which piece hits you the hardest. Now, let's talk about the huntsman and those organs for a second. In the story, the queen demands Snow White's lungs and liver. That sounds gruesome, but it's also very specific. In medieval German belief, the lungs were seen as containing the breath of life, the essence of youth. The liver was tied to vitality and the soul's energy. So when the queen wants those particular organs boiled and salted so she can eat them, it's not just evil queen being extra. It's basically ritual cannibalism, symbolic vampirism. She's trying to steal Snow White's youth, beauty, and life force from the inside out. But Snow White escapes, right? Happy moment, yeah? She runs into the forest, away from the palace, away from the mother who wants to kill her. Except she doesn't then go live her best cottagecore life with 7 magical little miners singing songs. The original context is way more depressing. The 7 dwarfs are almost certainly based on real child miners. In the regions where the Grimms collected their stories, children as young as 7 were sent into mines because they were small enough to crawl through the narrowest tunnels. Working in cramped, airless, dusty spaces, many of them ended up stunted, permanently bent, their growth damaged by hard labor and malnutrition. To outsiders, they would look like small adults, like little men. And where did these kids live? Often in isolated barracks or huts near the mines, hidden deep in the forests. They'd come back from work covered in dust and grime, collapsing into rough beds at night. Local girls, often runaways or orphans, would sometimes keep house for these miners in exchange for protection and food. So when Snow White arrives at a cottage deep in the woods, finds 7 tiny beds, 7 dirty plates, and 7 men who work all day in the mountains, medieval audiences wouldn't have thought, oh, magical dwarfs. They would have thought, miners, child labor, exploited kids. Snow White isn't rescued by whimsical fantasy creatures. She's absorbed into another brutal system. She trades palace danger for domestic servitude. She cooks, cleans, and cares for them in exchange for shelter. She's still a child. She's just moved from one form of exploitation to another. Now, the queen doesn't give up easily. And this is where the story starts looking like a medieval true crime profile. She tries to kill Snow White 3 times, first with the bodice laces, tightening them until Snow White can't breathe. Then with the poisoned comb, an item that's normally part of a gentle grooming ritual between mother and daughter. And finally, with the apple. Let's pause on that comb for a second. Combing a daughter's hair used to be this intimate act of care, a daily expression of tenderness. Turning that into a weapon is not an accident. The story is literally showing you how abuse can hide inside acts that are supposed to be loving. It's saying, even the most ordinary gestures can be twisted when the person in power decides you're a threat. And then, the apple. Red on one side, white on the other. The queen eats the safe half in front of Snow White to prove there's nothing wrong with it. The poisoned side goes to the girl. That's not just dramatic flair. That is exactly how some poisoners operated. You create what were called Judas fruits. Beautiful, partly poisoned pieces of food that kill slowly, so the person who gave them can walk away looking innocent. Snow White's symptoms in the tale: instant collapse, frozen body, preserved beauty, dilated eyes, and shallow, barely detectable signs of life, line up almost perfectly with certain real medieval poisons like deadly nightshade. She doesn't rot, she doesn't look sick, she just looks eerily perfect, as if death itself is trying not to disturb her beauty. Enter the glass coffin. And this is where things turn from horror story to disturbing social commentary. We like to think of the glass coffin as pure fantasy, but families did actually commission glass or crystal-topped coffins for young women who died under suspicious circumstances, especially in noble families. These coffins worked on several levels. First, they showed everyone, yes, she's really dead. There's no secret runaway, no pretend disappearance. She's gone. Second, they turned the dead girl into a display. Her beauty is preserved as a kind of advertisement of the family's good blood. Third, the glass keeps anyone from examining the body closely. No one can check for bruises, strangulation marks, or the signs of poisoning. She's visible, but untouchable. Perfect, but unreachable. That's exactly what happens to Snow White. She becomes a permanent exhibit, a beautiful object locked behind glass, with no say in what happens to her, even in death. And that's when the prince shows up. Forget the Disney kiss. In the Grimm's earlier version, the prince doesn't wake her with some romantic spell. He sees a beautiful dead girl in a glass box and becomes obsessed with her. Not curious, not concerned, obsessed. He begs the dwarfs to give him the coffin. He has his servants carry it around everywhere. His thing is basically, I can't live without looking at her. This is not a love story. This is necrophilic obsession dressed up in royal clothes. Only when the coffin is jostled and the piece of apple gets dislodged from Snow White's throat does she wake up. She doesn't wake up because love conquered death. She wakes up because some guy hauling her corpse around dropped her. It's not romance, it's a horrible accident that just happens to save her life. If you're still imagining bluebirds singing around her, I'm sorry. That version is dead now. The story doesn't stop there, though. It has one last message, and it's written in pure fire. At Snow White's wedding, the queen is forced to put on red-hot iron shoes and dance until she dies. That's not a random, gruesome detail. It was an actual punishment used in some legal traditions for a very specific crime: killing or attempting to kill close family members, especially your own children. In other words, the tale ends with a fantasy of justice that medieval audiences almost never saw in real life. The mothers who poisoned their daughters for power or inheritance rarely faced public dramatic punishment. The story gives people something the courts usually didn't: the sense that someone this monstrously abusive might actually get what she deserves. And here's where things get really chilling. All these brutal elements — cannibal mother, organ eating, child labor, toxic beauty standards, suspicious death, obsessive prince, fiery execution — weren't just random horrors thrown together. They were carefully chosen symbols. The Grimms even wrote a note to themselves in the margins of their working papers: reminder and warning. Snow White wasn't meant as light entertainment. It was a warning label on an entire social system. Even the numbers are doing work. 7 dwarfs, 3 murder attempts, 1 apple split in 2. 7 was the number of completion, Snow White's time in hiding, her full cycle of escape. 3 attempts wasn't just fairy tale rhythm. Under some Germanic laws, 3 failed attempts at killing a noble could elevate the crime to something like high treason. The split apple, the safe white half and poisoned red half, captures the whole theme. The same thing that looks like love can hide lethal intent. And don't forget Snow White's age in the earliest version: 7 years old. That's the age kids entered the mines, the age girls could be betrothed, the age some started appearing in court records as mysteriously dead in ways that benefited their families. 7 is the age when she becomes a target. Not because she's flirting, not because of teen jealousy, but simply because she's starting to become valuable. So what did the Grimms actually do here? They took things they knew from legal records: suspicious deaths, inheriting mothers, exploitation of children, and wrapped those horrors in enough fantasy that people could tell the story out loud without getting arrested or ostracized. The forest becomes a psychological no man's land, representing the nowhere place young girls could go when home wasn't safe. The mining cottage becomes a stand-in for underground networks where runaways might survive if they were lucky. And then, over time, we did to the story what the stepmother did to Snow White. We prettied it up and pretended the danger was gone. Later editions softened the mother into a stepmother. Adaptations toned down the violence. Disney nuked almost all the warning signs. The girl got older, the dwarfs got funnier, the prince got less creepy, and the mother became a cartoon villain instead of a painfully real one. But even kids today still feel that something is off. They ask why the mother wants Snow White dead, why she has to live with strangers, why the prince falls in love with a girl who looks dead. You can scrub the story, but you can't totally erase its bones. The skeleton is still there, and that skeleton is made of very real fears. The fear that your beauty makes you a target. The fear that the person who calls themselves mother might be the one holding the poison. That's why Snow White lasts. Not because of singing dwarfs, not because of true love's kiss. It lasts because underneath all the fantasy, it's preserving something nobody wanted to write in a court record: the fact that some of the worst crimes against children happen behind closed doors, inside respectable families, and that whole systems, legal, social, political, are sometimes built to look the other way. Snow White isn't just a fairy tale. It's an evidence file that survived by pretending to be entertainment. Once you see that, the story never looks innocent again. The fairest of them all was never really about beauty. It was about a child marked for death and a culture that needed a fairy tale to say what it couldn't admit out loud. If you made it this far, first of all, you're my kind of person. Second, I want to hear from you. Does this change how you see Disney's version? Do you think we should keep telling kids the sanitized version? Or should we admit where these stories really came from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you want more deep dives into the dark side of fairy tales, myths, and childhood favorites that are way more cursed than you remember, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next breakdown.